Okay.
Okay.
Well, welcome, everyone. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about this topic, and then maybe we could discuss some ideas after that. Is that okay? And if people have questions or something they want to think is really important that needs to happen right then, you can say so and I'll stop and then pick it back up. Okay. Part of the reason that I'm interested in this topic, which is children are not blank slates. I don't know how well that translates, but we use a lot of metaphors for children. Some of them are things like the blank slate, the clay to be molded, the empty pitcher to pour things into. I mean, we have lots of different metaphors, all of which kind of imply the same thing, which are that children are empty or blank, and we need to fill them in with appropriate societal values. So part of the reason I'm so interested in children is, I guess, my whole background. I was a therapist for 15 years doing non-directive play therapy with kids. I've also taught at the graduate level for 10 years for West Virginia University. I started a school in 1981, and I'm the mother of 2 children, one of whom's a pediatric pulmonologist, and the other one is a college grad who teaches at our school, or is on staff, I should say. Okay, can we go to the next one? All right, I wanted to start off with one of the quotes that I really like from Dewey, which is, there is no easier or cheaper way to deceive ourselves than by setting up something as an ideal in order to free ourselves from the responsibility of realizing it. And what I think he means by that is we get very nostalgic when we start talking about children, and we talk about them as innocent, helpless, cute little things that incorporate all the wonderful things that we wish that we could be, but we don't have the time or effort, or it's too late for us as adults. So that's one of the main ideals. Other ideals are that children are incapable of reason or thinking. One that's pretty popular around here is the heathens idea. Children are heathens. They're mischievous, they're immoral. They'll get in trouble if you don't watch out. And another one is the whole wax and clay, and that I talked about earlier, the blank slate. And then another one that I was mentioning at the beginning of this is the idea of them as little angels, or they're really born perfectly good, and it's only the mean, screwed up adults that ruin them. That if it wasn't for the adults, the kids would be great. And so those idealized concepts lead to some problems. One of the major problems, I think, is what goes on in conventional schools. Because when you have idealized versions of kids, you don't have real kids. You don't know who they actually are. And so what you tend to do is create, in the case of John Holt talks about the perfect secret garden, for that you build a wall around it and you put them in it and keep them protected. And you do, or if you think of them as heathens, then you have to punish them and make sure that they get rid of all the evil that's in them and turn into good people as they grow older. Or if they're blank slates, you have to write upon them. And so all of that leads to some conventional ideas that we see in schools and that allow traditional things to go on. Okay, let's go to the next one. The concept of children has changed throughout history. I'm using a couple of examples of historians here. There are many others, but one of the most common ones is Philippe Ariès, wrote in Centuries of Childhood. And what he did was he looked at the art of different periods. And during the Middle Ages, he found that there weren't pictures that involved children. They were just miniatures adults. And it wasn't until the 17th century that there were really pictures that either centered on children or had children involved in them. And he tied that up with the advent of the middle class. And the education system then that was developed during that time, where kids were separated from adult freedoms. Prior to that, they were able to wander through the world experiencing freedom and harsh consequences, such as hanging kids for stealing loaves of bread and that sort of thing that happened prior to that. They were just seen as little adults. And so his view of children is that our concept of the way that we look at children has evolved over time. Lloyd Demas, in History of Childhood, didn't agree with the way that Ariès viewed the child changing, but he did agree that the concept of childhood changed over time. And he said that it started out with kids being born evil, and you had to save their souls. That was your, as adults. And as schools, there weren't any in that at that time, but what really happened was the idea was churches and everything needed to bring these children out of being born evil and bring them into the light. But he said that required adults having very little sense of empathy for their children. But as time went on and as childhood evolved, children became dependent beings who were in need of nurturing. And the development of empathy in adults, particularly in parents, meant that they no longer had this overwhelming need to beat the crap out of the kids, I guess is the way to put it, to give them ice water baths, to do all the things that they needed to do to try to get the evil out and let them become good. And so they were able to start thinking about how do you deal with the needs of children. Yeah. So we have differing viewpoints of what children are as a group. And we have John Locke, who was famous for the blank slate. And education and schools, then the adults were to write on the blank slates and teach the children socially correct ways to behave. I'm going pretty quickly through this. If we want to talk more in detail on some of these, we can. Rousseau's Neill, people may be familiar with that. Children are born good. Adults have to not damage the children. A.S. Neill felt the same way, that children were born good. He also was concerned about not damaging the children. He felt that the school must fit the child. Dewey did not believe that. He was much more of a realist. And he thought children were born with innate, unique tendencies. They had impulses to reach out and interact with the environment. And they were born with an internal criterion of success and the power to grow. They had that originally when they were born. And so when they were learning to walk, for example, they had a criteria of what was successful walking, as they approximated that, they worked at it until they got it to where they wanted it to be for themselves, not for somebody else. And the power to grow was that they possessed that power to reach out and learn things and interact and experience the consequences of things. And then at that point, they could grow. Daniel Greenberg pretty much didn't deal with children under 4. And when children arrived at the age of 4, he said that they exhibited most of the characteristics of adults. So although he didn't talk of them as miniature adults, he did talk about them as having the most of the characteristics of adults by the time they're 4. Ability to reason, ability to use their intelligence, ability to interact, all of that. And then Peter Gray thought the children were born into the world naturally, little learning machines, curious and playful, and that what they had to learn to do was to adapt to the world. And we'll be talking more about the difference between people who see children learning to adapt to the world as opposed to children who are part of constructing the world, because it has fairly significant differences, those two views of children. Okay, let's. Okay. The concept of the child and how we do schooling. We talked about the assumptions of what children are like. And the conventional view is that children need to be shaped into good citizens. The children need to fit into an environment following adult models. The paradigm that I'm talking about, that I think we're talking about when we talk about democratic schools, is a new paradigm. We're seeing children as unique, active people who learn freely by freely interacting and potentially changing the world around them. So the society that they're in has to be willing to have children who are not just going to be quiet and sit and be seen and not heard, as they used to say when I was younger. The society has to be interested in having children interact with it and be willing to change. And that requires a different kind of society than the static society that really wants to stay the same and does not want children coming into it, making changes. Okay, shall we go ahead? Okay. One of the things that leads, I think, us to views of groups of children is normal development. And I run into normal development. I've run into normal development all my academic life because psychology was my undergrad degree. And my son is a doctor of children, a children's doctor. And so he thinks a lot about normal development. And the reason he does is because he's looking for illness. And so he tries to look at how do most kids look or act or weigh or how tall they are at a certain age. And if they're not, that means that there's something not normal about them. And so that could indicate some kind of problem. So when you look at it from a medical point of view, that is why the normal development is important. And when you have conventional education where you're trying to teach certain things in the curriculum that you want everyone to learn, and what you want to try to do is deal with groups of children who all behave the same way. And at different stages developed, they act certain ways, and you want to know how this group of children act at that age so that you can put them in a class with others who are doing the same thing. And for example, Erik Erikson, he describes emotional and social ways of being, which are age-linked. In his theories, children are not thought of as unique individuals. They're thought of typical beings who develop uniformly in steps toward the goal of adulthood. There are many stage theorists in psychology. Dewey, when he was younger, was a stage theorist too. The problem with stage theory is it leads to schools which employ standardized curricula, grades, grade levels, uniform dress codes, all of that rests on a concept of children who need to fit into their environment in order to develop properly. Normal development really depends upon having a concept of children that at certain ages they will be like, exhibit certain behaviors, and they will think certain ways, and they will feel certain ways, and they will behave certain ways, and all of that. Then it makes sense that they can be treated the same. And so schooling then comes, the school comes from the normal development of the child, or at least our concept of the child, our idea that children, this is how children are. Okay. Next. Okay. My experiences when I did non-directed play therapy were totally with, well, that's not true, but mostly with individual children. I had a couple of groups of kids, but very few. Mostly I worked individually with kids. And what I started learning about kids through non-directed play therapy, I don't know how familiar people are with that. It was started by Virginia May Axline in 1949. And there's a book called Dibs in Search of Self, which talks a lot about her experience with this child. And I think it's very helpful to read that if you're interested in non-directed play therapy. The idea behind non-directed play therapy is you provide an environment of caring, and an environment in which the child can do whatever they want to do within the framework of the place where they are, which is a playroom. And watching those children and interacting with those children, I learned, because my tools as a therapist were basically reflective listening, which is being a mirror to children. So what I did is my relationship with them was to reflect back what they were doing. Through that, they learned to cope with all kinds of things, from easy things like a younger brother or sister in the family, to complicated things such as parental divorce or abuse or death of a parent or family member or a friend. And it really taught me that children, individual children, have within themselves the ability to heal themselves. And it's a pretty amazing process to watch. So doing that taught me a lot about individuals, and I stopped looking at kids as whether they were experiencing normal or non-normal development, and started thinking about them in terms of who they were individually, because I watched them individually come up with all kinds of coping mechanisms and ways of dealing with things that I would never have imagined, and certainly didn't have in my textbooks up until that point. Okay. I do want to mention before I leave play that one of the things that Peter Gray says that I think is extremely helpful is that children play constantly, and their play is very important to them in terms of creating their world and figuring out where they are and who they are and all of that. But that if adults take control of that play, then it turns into work. It stops being play. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about school, because traditional school tends to schedule children and take away the control of their play, and it's no longer their own creative free play. It's play that adults have decided would be educational for them. And those two kinds of play are very different. So we'll move on to conventional versus democratic emotional environments. The authoritarian setting or traditional, it's often traditional, but in an authoritarian setting, children are afraid of making mistakes. And they really feel like that imitating the powerful people in their environment is the safest course to follow. I think that's true whether they're children or adults, but in the case of children, it's particularly true. And fear is a constant companion because your learning is focused on getting a good grade or conforming to the demands of your teacher or your parent or whatever. And making choices involves very little independent thinking. Instead, you spend your energy shaping yourself into a socially acceptable character. And so that's what goes on in an authoritarian setting. In a democratic school setting, in a caring environment, you can see conversations, creative play, physical interactions, problem solving, and it's based on mutual trust and respect and equal relationships. And those things are all assume that children are not helpless beings, that they are capable of developing freely if they have a caring environment. But that is an assumption. Those are two very different emotional assumptions about children. Okay, one is the helpless, need to be protected, need to be told what to do. The other thing about democratic schools is that trust takes time. And so we talk about in this slide, I'm talking about an authoritarian setting, and I'm talking about a caring democratic school setting. If you go from one to the other, particularly if you come from the authoritarian to the democratic school setting, it can take time before there's any trust that the other shoe's not going to drop and suddenly it's going to become an authoritarian setting. And so in that case, children can be fearful, carry the fearful companion that they have in authoritarian education with them into the democratic school situation. And it takes time for them to begin to trust because they start to see that other kids and other people are having this emotional and intellectual stake in creating the culture. And that that there's a democratic process that's protected, that they're building relationships, and that they're doing trust, but it takes time for that to develop. And in the meantime, you can have a lot of judicial things happen, or a lot of acting out, or a lot of unhappiness and struggle. But it's worth it because when kids do become invested in the democratic school and in the system, which is really trusting themselves and each other, they become stakeholders. And when they're stakeholders, then they really are creating the culture, and the decisions they make matter to the whole community and to themselves. Next one. I'm really hitting the tops of these things, so I hope we can talk more in depth about it. Probably the biggest problem with democracy is it assumes a growing, changing society. And some people call it progressive. I hesitate to do that because we use the word progressive so differently in various situations. I know in England, the word progressive means something very different than it does in the United States. So I'm trying to stay away from the word progressive, but a lot of people use that when they're talking about a society that is willing to change and grow and not try to hang on to norms that are written in stone. So if we want to perpetuate existing societal norms, it's good to use authoritarian adult-child relationships because you're teaching the child to adapt. If your concept of a child is that their role is to adapt to the world. In other words, they come into the world, perhaps a lump of clay, or perhaps with some native impulses, but primarily their role is to adapt to what is. To the extent that you believe that, then you really do want to perpetuate some of these existing societal norms through somewhat traditional education or schooling. If you think that democratic adult-child interactions are what you want, that you really want free choices, that you want children to be able to pursue their own interests, to contribute their own ideas to the society, then the society has to be willing to be flexible and has to value individual differences and individual input and be willing to change and grow. I personally think that life is about growth and change, and societies that don't grow and change have a much more difficult time surviving in the long term. But we also, as human beings, have a tendency to look for the quest for certainty. And we want traditions, and we want things that make us feel more secure. And that is the risk that we take. And many people are very willing to perpetuate existing norms in order to hang on to the sense of certainty that traditions provide. Whether we can have a combination of both of those things, I think is worth discussing. But of course, the authoritarian method of telling kids what to do, rewarding and punishing them, extrinsic sources of reinforcement, all of that goes with societies that are trying to perpetuate their existence, static societies. What are we doing here?
Sorry, we just got a text.
Okay.
Ryan had to leave.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Now, the paradigm shift that I've just finished writing a book about, and that everybody, I think, who's involved in democratic schooling has probably given a lot of thought about, is how we look at children as unique personalities, not in germ or potentially, but actually. So actually unique personalities, that they're not blank slates to write on, or empty vessels to pour knowledge into, or clay to be molded. The children, in the same way as adults do, they learn what they want to learn. They reach out to interact with the people and things in the world, and the interactions that they have change the world. I think one of the things that's probably the most important thing about the democratic process is that the democratic school values these individual reaching outs, these individual interactions, and sees it as essential as part of their culture and part of their growth, that without them, they would not be able to function in any kind of meaningful way. And so because they see it as essential, it becomes a symbiotic relationship. You have an individual and you have a society, and they both depend on each other. I know that there are a lot of views of children that children are social and they have social instincts, but they're also individuals, and those two things conflict. And so they can't be both. They can either be social or they can be individuals, but they can't be individuals and social. And I think the view of the child that I'm trying to say in this particular paradigm is that they are both able to be individuals and able to interact socially, so long as the community values them. And that's when individual rights are involved. The individual rights are there to protect both the individual child and the society or the community. And so it's critical that individual rights are part of the democratic school, because it keeps them both alive. Do we have one more? Just getting back to review a little bit, the ability of a child to play, think, and reason comes from an early age. Psychologists are finding, I have studies that I've quoted in the book, that earlier and earlier the children are able to think, are able to distinguish things, are able to play, are able to do all kinds of things way before we thought they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the new concept of the school is that interactive democratic schools value individual rights, which protect both the child and the community. And so they can use their intelligence to solve problems, they can create their own play, they can follow their own interests, and they can interact and communicate with other people on an equal basis. So that's really a very shorthand version of why I think it's important that our concept of the child be tied into the school. But I think it is critical that we be aware of what assumptions we're making about children when we're talking about the school that we're creating. And that's pretty much it.
You want to stop sharing?
Yeah.
Open it up for discussion.
Yeah. Questions, discussion. I need a little water and then I'll start something. We talk a lot about self-direction, and I am big on self-direction because that's what I have seen in children most of my life. But I get concerned about self-directed schooling that people talk about because they drop off democracy. They talk about self-directed. If you have self-directed learning, for example, that's sufficient for kids in a school or in a home situation, either one. That if kids are self-directed, then we don't need to worry about having a democratic school. And I think that's problematic.
Okay, and can you tell why? Why is it problematic?
I think it's problematic because it leaves out the interaction part between the community around the child. Let's talk about the child right now. It leaves out the community interactions that when a child reaches out in the environment, they do something and then something happens. They undergo the consequences of whatever they've done. And in a social life, in a physical world, that's certain things happen. But in the social life, the consequences can be to change the way of life of the school, of the community. It can be to change the culture so something else happens. It can be a whole, in other words, it's not just that the child reaches out and imitates the things he sees going on or she sees going on around them. It's and adapts to that. It's that he or she reaches out and changes things because their interactions have an effect on the other people, and then the other people interact with them, and then the culture gets built through all these interactions. And so I think not having that culture, not having that community, not having the democracy, which values individual rights, and so individual rights are protected. Not having that, I think, is not enough. Self-direct, it's kind of like necessary but not sufficient. Yes, we need self-direction in terms of learning and in terms of following your interests and all of that, but we also need to take into consideration the interactions that happen as a result of what you're doing as a child or anybody at this point, but we're talking about the child right now. And furthermore, I don't think kids grow up. I think kids grow up very differently if they don't experience being in a school or a community or a whatever, where the people around them are treating them with trust and respect and as a part of a community that makes decisions where they have an equal voice. Oh, Mike?
Yep. I don't know what to say actually, because everything you said I can agree to, and there was not one surprise in all your talk to us. I think to me, and I know Meta and Henning pretty much, and I don't know Travis and Romain, but this is the basis of our thinking, of our way to approach the world and the children's world for 20 and more years now. And so my question was actually, who are you addressing? You don't, I think you can't convince me of this because I am convinced already. So there is, who is the audience? That is the question. And I don't know what to clarify. I mean, there could be some minor differences between quotes from Rousseau or something like that and Lloyd de Morse. And these people you mentioned at the beginning, I read these books about 25 years ago or more, even more, when I started to come into this field. I don't remember the details, but this is all a part of the way of thinking here in this sphere. And now what are we doing now? I don't know.
It seems to me, and maybe it's because I read so much of Daniel Greenberg's stuff, and also Peter Gray as well. It seems to me that there's a pattern going on right now where democracy is being dropped from the discussion. Almost, maybe it's mentioned in passing, but sometimes not at all. And where we are going is into self-determination, self-determined learning. And I think that that is a dangerous thing to do, because I think we're taking the individual child out of the social situation and saying it doesn't matter what the social situation is, as long as individuals can have self-direction. Doesn't have to be a democracy, doesn't have, it could be any situation.
Doesn't have to
And
be a
then-
school.
No,
Doesn't
doesn't have-
could be unschooling, for example.
yeah,
So you would be critical about unschooling.
yes,
Okay. I agree as well a little bit, but not totally, because yeah, but because we in Germany, we have problems with the law in our country regarding homeschooling and not going to school. There is a how do you say that? An obligation. You have to go to school. There is no way around the school.
compulsory, right?
Yeah.
Compulsory.
Compulsory, that word was it, compulsion. And but when I talked to people with homeschooling experiences and friends of this way of living, they always argue that these children are not free of social life and interaction. So just to say homeschooling or individual learning at home is free from social interaction and solving social problems, that would not be true. So I'm in favor of schools or learning environments with several children as well, too, yes, but it is not necessarily damaging to the children if they don't go to a school and have other circumstances. But it is actually, it's a small.
Maybe not. Maybe it's not a small issue. I would like to hear what Candy answers.
I don't think it is a small issue. And it partly comes from a definition of democracy that is much greater than just a form of government. It's seeing democracy as a valuation of a way of living.
Yeah.
And do I think that homeschooling or unschooling or any of those things, I mean, we have life that happens all the time outside of schools. And do I think that's horrible? No, I don't think that's horrible. I don't think it's democracy, though. And we live in a theory. In theory, we live in a democratic society here in this country and in your country. The idea behind having a democracy is that we have equal rights and we have individual rights. And because of those things, we have interactions that shape the society and allow the society to change and not be stuck with social norms that can't be changed, traditions that can't be changed. It's a value statement. I think democracy is a value statement. And so I would argue that living in a democracy allows children to become responsible adults and go out in the world and use those skills that they've developed, that they can't develop living in a cave. And I would argue that they don't develop as well just homeschooling.
Mike and Meta, we were talking about this German organization DGD. It's an organization in Germany which tries to democratize state schools. And they have a notion of democracy a bit like yours, I think, Candy. They talk about 3 levels of democracy. Democracy as a form of government, democracy as a societal form, and democracy as a living form of living.
Mhm.
And maybe we can find this definition from their homepage and put it in our definitions, because maybe that's what Candy is referring to also.
What do they do with that? I mean, what do their schools look like?
They are far from democratic schools like we know them, but they try to put a bit more democracy into state schools. And they and on a theoretical basis, they argue that democracy is not just a form of government, it's also a form of living. That's what they say. And they try to put democracy into state schools. It's far from what we know as democratic schools, because state schools are such regulated entities. It's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Their main goal, just to explain it a little bit further, their main goal is to implement democracy as a school subject. So children should know how society actually should work or works.
Yeah,
so
but they also try to.
It's not the only. It's not reduced to it. They offer the option to the classes to have open discussions through 1 or 2 hours a week, so they can experience some decision makings on their own. But it is very, very much reduced to minor things. It's not like our school, where the whole school, or almost the whole school, is managed by the school itself. So it's like a playground for children to experience parts of democracy, and it is all more or less set by the adults and the schoolmaster, the headmaster.
It's a little bit like teaching democracy instead of living democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing. That's the thing that breaks my heart in a way about what happens in Sudbury Valley, because I've been to Sudbury Valley on several occasions, and I love Sudbury Valley's democratic life, but they don't talk about it as democratic life. They talk about it as self-determined learning. Now, Dan Greenberg has talked about immersion in democracy, and so I guess in some ways I'm not talking about Dan to some degree, but they still say if we had some other way of governing that worked just as well, we would do it. There's no recognition that the democracy part of what they're doing, which I feel like is much closer to what we do than the state schools who teach about democracy. Still, they're doing it without calling it anything, basically. And I think in part that's because they're saying, okay, we take for granted that every person who's at school, whether 4 and up, are the same as far as they have the same vote, they count the same, they are the same in judicial process. And they don't at all think about what I call praxis. They don't think about, okay, how does our philosophy tie in with what we do? And so because they don't do that, and they don't talk about the society around them's concept of children, I don't think they're in the fight for convincing people in our democracy, in our United States democracy, that children can flourish in a democratic school. I think that they look at, and in fact, a lot of the kids come out of Sudbury Valley saying, well, this worked for me, but I wouldn't want it for my kids because you know, it was something weird. There's something weird about me. And so I needed that kind of school. But my kids will be normal, and so they can go to regular school. And I think that that is all comes from not having an awareness of the philosophy of what they're doing. At least I feel strongly about that, that if we could look at, yes, what children need as they grow up is to be a part of a culture in which they are treated as equal members of that culture and have individual rights in that culture, that they see that and that they contribute to that culture by virtue of the fact that they live there. And I think that that's, and so they're valuable members of the society. They are stakeholders in that democratic school. And I don't think that that ends up being as delineated or as clearly said as it needs to be.
This is very interesting because I always thought that Sudbury Valley School, which I visited once for a day, half a day, on a trip around this area, that this was, and I read a lot of it, and Henning did a lot of interviews with people from different Sudbury-like schools, and we talked about that, we discussed it a lot, but the impression always was that they might avoid the word democracy or democratic school, but they actually do democracy because they have a voting system, they have a judicial system, they have a bureaucracy and administration, and all the elements of a functioning democratic state or country they have implemented in their system. So even if they don't use it and they don't take it in front of them and presenting themselves as democratic, they actually have all the features and all the elements available. And so the children who are not reflecting, might not reflect this, by the way, automatically experience the democratic way of living and of organizing life. So why do you see such a big difference between describing this as centered on self-determination and individualistic when it is factually very democratic? So why is it so important to separate these two aspects?
I think that's a wonderful question. That is the question that I am trying to get at. I think it's absolutely critical that we call things what they are. And that I'll go back to Praxis again. I have an example. Well, there's several, but one example is there was a school that they tried to form in New England, not Sudbury, but they wanted it to be a democratic school, but they didn't call it anything. And they had teachers that had been in traditional schools, and they just took a bunch of kids and they started their school. And as it went along, what happened was the teachers kept falling back into their conventional ways of teaching because that's what they were accustomed to doing. And the kids felt like they were not being listened to, and so the whole thing ended up falling apart. If they'd been able to talk about what it is they were trying to do, I think they would have been better off, and they could have maybe gotten it together or not, decided not to, but they could at least have talked about what their philosophy was when they started the school, which they didn't. They just said, let's have an alternative school. And then at the end, they were saying, wow, this is not very democratic. This is not, but they didn't really have any thought about it. Another example is more specifically is Hudson Valley School, which is a very democratic school. It's very similar. We've been there. They have a procedure in the judicial system where they allowed double jeopardy to happen. Now, for us in our school, double jeopardy violates due process and is not, and what it is if you're tried and you're found guilty, found innocent, you can still go in front of the school meeting and be found guilty. So the second time around, that can't happen at our school because that's double jeopardy. But the issue is an issue that we talk about at a school meeting, is an issue that we figure out there as part of our democratic process, because one of the things that we do a lot of is saying, okay, here's our philosophy, here's what we're doing. How does what we're doing go along with our philosophy? And if you don't do that, I think one of the things that can happen is that you go along, or you run into other schools and you lose track of who you are, or you adopt a model and you just slavishly follow it.
Or you change.
Or you change and become some other school, right? And
changing
changing
is not a bad thing, isn't it?
No,
you said it yourself.
Changing may not, no, changing can be a very good thing, but it also can be a very bad thing.
Yeah.
That's happening in this country right now.
Okay, but up until now, your argument is you should know what you are doing if you are starting a school. You should have a philosophy, and you should know what your philosophy is. And your philosophy could be, we would like to be like the Sudbury Valley School, and they don't call themselves democratic, so we don't call ourselves democratic, because we want to do it like they do it, and then you have a philosophy. But I think your point is something else, isn't it? I think your point is that the Sudbury Valley School, in your view, doesn't emphasize the value of democracy.
Yes.
And apart from being confused in a process of starting a school, what else is bad about it?
There are a lot of practices that happen, and I'm on Staff Link, and I don't know if other people are, that talk about different people in the Sudbury model schools talk about things that happen at school, and things that happen at school can end up being very undemocratic without any thought, because there's no awareness of, there's nothing to compare it to, or what's an example at our school where we've had, now I can use our own examples of when we had trouble with things that were not democratic. Oh, I remember the very first thing, the reason I call this book Crying Under the Apple Tree. Okay, when in our school, people vote on whether somebody is expelled eventually. I mean, it's a process. It doesn't happen immediately, but in the end, if they're a danger to the school community, that's the vote. Well, that happened to us early on, I guess about our third or fourth year. And the kids voted to expel a kid who was being pretty violent with other kids. But my feeling was that he could be a member of the group, of the society, and he was going to be, I don't know, I was young, lost forever, I'll put it that way, gone from our group. back into a situation that I didn't think was democratic at all or even cared about him. And I lost that vote. So I went outside under the apple tree and I cried. And I thought, I shouldn't trust children. we shouldn't be doing democracy with children because children aren't capable of doing democracy. Here they are, they've just thrown this person out without any awareness, in my opinion, without the awareness I had of who this person was. And then in the end, we had a procedure that if you're thrown out, if both parents come in and are interviewed and you go through the whole admissions process again, you go on probation, you can be a member of the community. And this kid who was kicked out did all that and eventually graduated from our school. So they were right and I was wrong. It worked out for that family. The father in that family had refused to come to school, wouldn't have any part of it. And because of his son, him having to come in with his son in order for him to come back to school, he became a big part of the school and became very much a part and was very supportive of the school. All of that never would have happened if it had been my way of doing things. And so that taught me many things, but one thing was we need to keep our philosophy strong. We need to not give up on it. We need to keep the practices that we do consistent with what our philosophy is. If we want to have this kind of school, if we really believe, and I believe in this kind of school, I believe in democracy. I believe that children are capable of being self-determined. I don't have any doubt of that.
And your philosophy, you are saying you have to have a strong philosophy, so you stick to your philosophy, and you can be aware that if you are doing things differently, then you know, oh, it's not in line with our philosophy.
I know about another example is we had a child come recently into the school who came from public school, that's traditional school, and he wanted to build a volcano, and he kept going around to all the staff asking them to teach him to make a volcano, and people wouldn't do it. But some of the staff members really wanted to do that because they wanted him to be happy at the school, and they wanted to help him have a volcano because that's what he wanted to do. And so there was we had staff discussions, lots of discussions about why are we doing this? Why are we not doing this? And in the end, he figured out that he had to go to the school meeting and ask for a committee to be set up and materials. And there was an 11-year-old girl who was the chair of the committee, and he got his volcano in the end, and they built it and painted it, and it was really cool. But he was so accustomed to staff or teachers telling him what to do and doing things for him that he didn't want to do it. I'm not sure that he didn't know, because I think he was a pretty smart kid. I think he had figured out how he could do it. He just thought it would be easier if the staff would do it. And he would just kind of get his volcano and not have to do any of the work or figure anything out. But we wanted, as staff, we were conflicted because we wanted him to be a part of the school, and we wanted him to stay there. And so I guess I'm trying to say it helps us as a staff to stay true to the philosophy of the school if we can look at specific examples and discuss them.
Does the philosophy of your school, can it change? Is it possible that it changes? has it changed?
And I agree to this.
Yeah, I think it has changed significantly. Before, we were more of a progressive school when we started. That's why I don't use the word progressive. We didn't learn about Sudbury Valley till 3 years after we started the school. So when we learned about Sudbury Valley, then we embraced Sudbury Valley and went there and went to conferences and
after that, did it change after that? Or can
yes,
it
and then it changed after that. I started reading Dewey and became more in the democratic philosophy then began to make a lot more sense in terms of what they were doing at Sudbury Valley, that they were doing democracy, that they were living democracy, that they were actually, that's what they were doing, but they weren't calling it that. And because they weren't calling it that, I feel like they're more vulnerable to people who come in and say change just for change's sake, not change because there's a good reason to change.
Yeah.
I have a question because I didn't get the story completely. What you told when you had cried under the apple tree, and then the boy had to go because the students had voted on removing this student. And then the parents applied again and had to go through the admission process again. So he was again the same person, a student after having been expelled and invited again. So that was a good experience, what you liked afterwards. But,
Yeah.
But you said it was good that they, the students and the others, stuck to the philosophy or to the concept of the school. And the concept was they have the right to vote about everything. And
Yep.
and you thought it's a mistake because you had some like mother-like feelings or something. Okay, I see. Now I got the story. So then the boy behaved properly or better or compatible to the system.
Yes,
right?
much more. And not only that, his father was part of it too and came to work days and helped build the buildings, and his whole family became more supportive of what the school was.
But it could have, but for my understanding, it could have been like this, that you,
not, right?
Wait a minute, it could have been like this, that your opinion or your view onto the school was the concept, and that you had the power or the influence to keep this boy in school because it would be such a damage for his future if they vote him out. So why did you have this first concept that the children have the power? Was it after you have got to know the Sudbury concept, or was it before? Where from did you have the democratic concept?
It was before.
So you set up the democratic concept.
It was just, or maybe transition. It was really early.
Yeah,
it was right about that.
How did you come to this democratic concept? You didn't.
Well,
where did you have it from, and how did you calculate the situation of removing a poor child, maybe with not enough reasoning? So this was a risk.
Yeah, it was a risk. There were a lot of different ways that I personally came to it. The people around me also. I mean, it wasn't me that went to Sudbury Valley. It was another staff member, Alan, who went to Sudbury Valley and came back and said, this is really neat. This is better than what we're doing. And so then we talked about it and read stuff and said, yeah, this is better than what we're doing. And so, but I also then was working on writing this book and doing my doctorate in Dewey and the concept of the child. And so I was also making connections with how children interact. And then I was also doing play therapy on the side with children, and I was watching individual children cope with really hard problems in their lives on their own without being told how to do it, without traditional, this, of course, this is psychology, but traditional psychological means. I mean, non-directed play therapy is a legitimate thing, but it's a very small group of play therapists. Most play therapists tell the children what to do and help them come to some goal and set up goals and all that. And that's not what I did. And so what I did was learn from those children so that they could tackle all of life's problems. And so it's not, so my faith in children's ability to do things increased hugely. But my trust was still, I mean, I grew up very traditional education. And so it was still, that was a very hard moment, that moment under the apple tree, because I cared about that kid, and I could see him being gone and not coming back. And certainly that's happened before at our school. But in this case, and whether it was right or, I mean, whatever the decision, the process was the right process. I mean, we did it the way it should have been done. People felt the way that they felt, and that was the decision they made, and I lost that decision. Didn't mean that the process was wrong. It just meant that in my case, I lost that decision.
But now I'm
and that's Praxis, yeah.
Yeah, I see it's a very, very interesting story and the whole thing, but now I'm a little bit lost again. Why do you, I mean, the issue of complaining about Sudbury's lack of declaring democracy of an essential part of their system. That is what you are complaining about, if I'm not wrong. That you say they support children in their individual development, and that is pretty nice, and they have some structures. But what is the final criticism on their approach? Not declaring that this is a kind of democracy, or even if it is one?
Let me say about Praxis. Praxis is word and action. So you have the word to describe what you're doing, and you have the action, which is what you do. If you don't have the action, you just have the word, you have bullshit, I guess, short version. Yeah. If you just have actions, you can get lost. You can be susceptible to changes that you're not aware of coming, and that can destroy your school. And I worry about Sudbury Valley in the climate of our country right now, not being able to defend themselves in terms of what they're actually doing. That what they're doing is extremely valuable beyond what they're saying it is. I guess this is the way I'm not sure I'm being clear. Let Karen talk.
Okay.
So I think that it could be, it's not just having a good, solid philosophy when you start your school. It's as you're going along, making the time and the space to reflect on your own actions as an individual as part of that democracy, but also with others. So when you're talking about, certainly when you're talking about the role of a staff member in a democratic school, having feedback of how you practice your philosophy. So if you have an interaction with a student, an individual student, at least for me as a staff member, I want not just the students, but other staff and anyone else that observed that interaction to tell me whether that fit with the philosophy. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So it's not just having the philosophy and having the actions that you have, it's connecting them together and thinking about it, reflecting. I think when Candy was crying under the apple tree all those years ago, she was reflecting on her philosophy, what she runs her mouth about. And then when it came right down to it, how did her actions fit with that philosophy? And I think Sudbury schools are not doing that. I don't think that they're taking the time to understand and reflect on their interactions with anyone else in the democratic community, because they're missing that important democratic part that Candy was talking about earlier. That's my 2 cents.
Henning, did you understand everything? I mean, I did understand all the words. I have no problems with English, but sometimes I don't get.
I have another question. I have another question which leads in another direction, but maybe it could.
Can I answer one thing about the apple tree thing?
I want to.
I do think I was reflecting. I didn't say that. I do think I was reflecting whether I should stay a part of this school or whether I should go. I think that was part of what was going on in my head. And so I think that is important. I was thinking about what's my role in this philosophy? What's my actions?
But regarding Sudbury Valley School, and your fear that they might get lost somewhere because of their not clear definition of their structure or their system. I don't understand that, because they have, as far as I know, they have, like our school and other schools, a longer list of rules and a kind of a law book or some laws in their school, and they are all elaborated through the years. And there is, like in some other democratic and Sudbury schools, like a golden rule, which is a kind of a base, a fundament of a basic fundament, the freedom of the person and the cooperation and something like that. We have a kind of golden rule in our school as well. And this makes the school strong. And what are you afraid of? Do you think they could remove the law book and then they have a kind of chaos, or that it is well established, the whole thing there? Why do you think they could lose the guidance through society, like you said in your general country, like Mr. Trump, or I don't know what you are referring to?
Yeah. Well, I think that being able to convince people, I'm thinking a lot of the vaccination right now, but trying to convince people to do something that they don't necessarily think is wise requires being able to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think they can explain what they're doing. What worries me is whether they can explain why they're doing it.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big difference between the democracy as an institution and sort of bureaucracy that protects the community, and then also the community interactions that sort of build up those sort of protections from change. So like something I know right now, there's a pretty big difference between the sort of American constitutional rights, as we call them, rights, what the founders of the United States thought of as rights as a concept, and sort of the contemporary United Nations version of rights. Whereas one is like education, clean drinking water, healthcare, things that people need to survive sort of rights, and American rights are more protections that individuals have from their government. So freedom of speech, right to privacy, those sorts of things, they're very different. And if you don't take time to talk about those differences, you can find popular opinion or people trending toward one way or another. And I'm not trying to say that one is right and one is wrong, but if you don't talk about it, you can stray from the initial intentions of how things were structured.
I have a question for all of you, but probably for Candy also. I know that I've talked about it in one of our meetings, I think, that Summerhill explicitly is critical about using the term democratic. And as far as I've understood them, there's a good reason for it, because they fear that if you call yourself democratic as a school, you tend to try to raise children being a good democratic citizen. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to fall back. That's my interpretation. I'm not sure if it's really their reason, but my interpretation of them being critical about the term democratic is because they don't want to raise children being good Democrats. It's not their goal. And they fear probably that if schools use the term democratic, they fear, I'm exaggerating maybe now, they fear that children are abused for political goals. We want to stabilize our democracy in our country, so children have to learn democracy. So that's why we call our school democratic school.
But it's not wrong. It's not bad.
It's like Demokratiepädagogik Meter. It's like they fear Demokratiepädagogik.
When I talk to Zoe, I talk to her from some time to time because they do have a boarding school, and we have a boarding school. Before COVID, we had a boarding school. And so but when I asked her about the democracy thing, she said that they thought that people in the world's view of democracy was very bad right now. And so they didn't want to be associated with it, that they wanted to stick with progressive, which is where the whole progressive thing. That's why I didn't use the word progressive, because she felt like progressive means something very different in England than it does in this country. And so we have to watch words. But democracy is, yes, it's definitely a political thing for Zoe. And so that was certainly, but it was more that they didn't want the school to be, I mean, they do what they do democratically. They have their meetings democratically. But they still have decisions that are made by the staff. So it's not what I would call a democratic school. But it's not because the democracy, I think, for them is they don't want to be associated with a movement. They want to be Summerhill. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think we can ask them again. I thought of writing Henry Redhead an email. Maybe I will do it, and I ask him again.
Yeah, I don't know what Henry would say. Yeah, could be.
But I think we could have another title for the enterprise we are in, the enterprises we are in, and that is not what you are looking for, as I understood, or what you are aiming for, that is having a concept within. You can check whether you are still not leaving the base or not being consistent with what you are doing, having a kind of checking option. What are you? Am I still correct or right what I do? And that doesn't have to be necessarily democracy or this particular way of arranging society. It could be something different, like I could suppose from Summerhill, that is having a happy life of every child. And it's just said straightforward now. I don't know, you could formulate it more proper, but having a happy life of every child includes having the opportunity to interact and to arrange yourself with the broader school, and not just the individual happiness, having stuff or having spare time or so, even including arrangement. And then you could have a guidance line or guideline for evaluating your activities within the school. And it would not be democracy. It would avoid the word democracy, but it would still be a guideline. It would be children have to be happy, have to have freedom and responsibility, and these both aspects. And maybe this is the approach of Summerhill. And they say they don't have to worry about staff hiring and things like that, and the bigger money for the buildings, what is the family responsible for there. So could you imagine to agree to this approach of a constitution for a school, free of the word democracy?
Well, except that Neill was not free of the word democracy. Neill said he just limited the democracy to social democracy of the kids. But he felt that was really important. In fact, he said it was more important than any curriculum or textbook, was the social democracy that they had. So he felt that was important, but he didn't feel like that was important for everything. He didn't think it was that important for running the school or hiring the teachers or any of that. So, and yes, happy children, certainly.
But maybe
For me, it's too less to say happy children. It's
but this is
I know.
it's a short version.
Yeah,
it's a very
where I started.
reduced title, but. Let's come back to the Sudbury Valley approach. Maybe they have a similar, some of them, Mimsy and Daniel, have a similar approach, and they say we don't want to declare us as a specific type of system. We have the approach, every child has the right to develop and to raise properly in connection with other children. I think they wouldn't deny the relationship between the community, inside the community, and between the people there. So why is this to be blamed? Maybe it's okay not to call it democracy, or not to have. I'm a little bit confused.
I didn't understand. Yeah. I'm very proud to have a democratic school, not a happy children school also. I didn't get it why you are against this democratic thing. To call it democratic, if you want, it is democratic. Ik wist niet hoe het is. Los, sag mal.
Wen meinst du jetzt?
Na, dich meine ich.
Me?
Well,
No,
Mike, Mike.
Meta is asking me.
Yes, I ask you. What is
No, I'm not against calling anything a school a democratic. I'm not against it, but I'm just trying to get rid of the confusion I'm in now. I understand the approach of Candy that you have to have a kind of guideline to be safe in difficult situations and to check your activity against your principles. And that is what she is blaming Sudbury Valley. They just act like they act and everything can happen and there is no broader goal. That is what I understood. And Summerhill itself says, we don't call ourselves a democracy, we just do things and we live. And this is from this point very similar, despite the way they organize and manage their daily life, and they have different structures and things like that. And I think they both function somehow. And I'm just trying to understand why they don't do that, calling themselves democracies. And that is not that I'm in favor of not calling our school or a school a democratic school. It is just to understand what is going on here. That is my point.
Okay.
I would like to go back. I think that we could talk for a long time about specific things that are different or the same in different schools. And I feel very strongly that all of us are making huge steps away from conventional schools that treat children as pieces of clay or minds to be molded or blank slates or any of that. So we've already made a huge step. So I'm not blaming, that word bothers me. It's not that I'm blaming them.
So sometimes I'm not good enough in English. Maybe there's a better word.
Okay.
I mean, complaining about their...
Because I have much respect for them and what they have done. I think, and so I don't want that to be, and also for Summerhill as well. I think that some of the problems, though, that I see, and I see them in other Sudbury model schools, is the word model. And I think that when you're talking about democratic process, it as a way of life, it almost by definition means it's those people in that situation and their experiences, as opposed to these people over here in this situation with their experiences. They're not going to be the same because people are different and individuals are different. And so I feel like we can talk about processes and judicial processes, and we can talk about democratic processes, and we can talk about principles or whatever, and we can talk about actions and how they reflect on those. But when we try to make models, when we try to make things that are the same everywhere, it's problematic. And that's another problem that I have with Sudbury model. Sudbury Valley is fine. Hudson Valley is fine. They're different places. They're different schools. They're not identical. And I don't think they should try to be identical. They're not blueprints. I mean, we don't have a blueprint for a school. We're all the same. I don't think we are all the same.
Because the concept of the child is that it interacts with the world around them.
Right.
If you're coming at it from that philosophy, it's every school is going to be different based on who's there.
To this point, as I talked several times with Mimsi Sadowski, and when she was in Germany and when we were there, and she always would support this approach. She always said, we are Sudbury Valley and we have some experiences, but every school is an individual school and they have their own rules and they develop by their rules and they are not a copy. There is just some basic ideas we could tell them what we experienced, like having a judicial committee and other things, other details, but they sometimes they themselves disagreed. That is a complicated point, but sometimes they didn't like to be a model. They used it a little bit being a brand, or like Sudbury, and they sold stuff for starting a school and things like that. On the one hand, on the other hand, they said what we are proposing is just a starting point for a developing institution, which could come to another end always. So I don't know how much this is again a blaming kind of.
Yeah. I think that the model is a problem. The word model. But we could talk about that some more. This has been great. Thank you, guys. We're going to have to wind up because we have judging now at school, and I have to go. We have to go. And we said an hour and a half, and we've been an hour and a half. So.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting. We have to continue to this discussion.
I hope so. Who is this a person here?
What is Romain? What is
He's in hospital, or?
Yeah.
Are you sick?
Oh yeah.
No. It's okay. It's okay.
You're just lying in bed?
But
Okay.
it's a special bed, I think. No?
It looked like a hospital.
Yeah.
I did. Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Romain.
Yeah,
And I'm hoping to see many of you on Saturday.
Yes.
this Saturday or no next? No,
Nee,
this.
I think it's this.
The 8th.
This
The
Saturday.
8th.
Okay. I don't know. Maybe.
Seid ihr da? Ihr nicht? Seid ihr nicht da?
Yes, I'm just, I didn't have my calendar there, but probably yes.
Doch, wir sind da.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
yeah,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Romain, what about you? What is happening with you?
No, it's okay. I'm alive. It's the most important thing.
What happened?
Oh, those, you know. Okay, thank you. Oh, complicated. Maybe later.
Okay.
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 Get better soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Candy.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.